The heat in Magnolia County could suffocate a confession. At night, the land came alive with sounds that didn't belong to nature, the faint crying of a woman, the low hum of a hymn echoing through the cypress trees. No one went out after sunset. They said that was when the dead Launce walked, restless, searching for what had been taken from them. It wasn't superstition anymore, it was law. Children were warned never to look into the church windows after dark, for they might see faces that no longer lived. And in that stillness, the line between the living and the damned blurred, as if the family's sins had seeped into the soil and taken root. Magnolia County had no written history, only stories passed in whispers, and every one of them began with the same truth, that nothing pure could grow from the blood of the Launce. Clara May had grown up on the outskirts of Magnolia County, in a cabin her mother once kept spotless despite the dirt that seemed to crawl in through every crack. She had been raised to be obedient, quiet, and grateful for whatever blessings the Lord sent her way. When Samuel Lorne came calling, dressed in his Sunday best and speaking in a voice so soft it barely stirred the air, her mother told her it was a sign from heaven. A Lorne choosing a girl like her, plain, poor, and without a name worth repeating, was considered a miracle. But in Magnolia County, miracles always came with a price. Samuel wasn't like other men. There was something fragile about him, something too still, as if he were always listening for something unseen. His pale eyes never quite met hers, and when they did, it felt less like affection and more like recognition, as though he was remembering her from somewhere she'd never been. He told her he worked the land with his father, Reverend Abel Lorne, and that their family believed in strong blood and strong faith. The Reverend had approved of the match before Samuel even asked, saying it was God's will for the bloodline to continue untainted. The words made Clara's mother tear up with pride, though Clara herself didn't fully understand them. She just knew that the Reverend's blessing meant safety, food on the table, and a place to belong. The wedding was small, held in the Lorne family church under a ceiling that sagged like an old man's back. Abel Lorne performed the ceremony himself, his voice smooth and commanding, filling the room with the weight of his authority. When he placed Samuel's hand over Clara's, his touch lingered too long, his eyes studying her like she was something fragile to be owned. She felt the chill even in that summer heat but smiled the way her mother had taught her to. The congregation watched in silence, their expressions unreadable, as if they already knew what kind of life awaited her. After the vows were spoken, Clara followed her husband to the Lorne farmhouse, a sprawling relic of decaying grandeur surrounded by dying magnolias. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and rot. Portraits of pale ancestors stared down from every wall, each with the same sharp features and hollow gaze. Samuel led her through the halls quietly, never explaining the whispers she thought she heard behind closed doors. That night, as the floorboards creaked and the wind hissed through the trees, Clara realized that her marriage wasn't just to Samuel, it was to the entire Lorne legacy, and the house itself seemed to welcome her like something alive, waiting for her to take her place among the ghosts that came before. In the weeks that followed her wedding, Clara began to notice the quiet rhythm of the Lorne household, a pattern that revolved entirely around Reverend Abel. Every morning, the old man's voice carried through the walls as he prayed before dawn, his words thick and low, more like an order than a plea. He visited often, more than any father-in-law she'd ever heard of, and every visit began the same way, with him asking if she'd prayed for purity that day. He would sit at her kitchen table, his hands folded neatly on the worn wood, eyes lingering too long as he spoke about duty, sin, and the ways a wife must serve her husband's bloodline. At first, Clara thought it was kindness. The Reverend's attention made her feel seen, chosen, as though God himself had marked her for something special. The townsfolk admired him, calling him the hand of heaven in Magnolia County. He baptized their children, blessed their marriages, and buried their dead. To them, his presence was sacred. But to Clara, it began to feel suffocating. He always arrived unannounced, often when Samuel was away working the fields. Sometimes, he brought his Bible. Other times, just a jar of honey or a basket of apples from the church orchard. He'd say they were gifts, tokens of care for his new daughter, but there was something about the way he said it that made her skin crawl. He would ask her to read scripture aloud while he listened. His voice would echo hers, soft and steady, repeating the same verses about obedience and the sanctity of family. When she stumbled on the words, his hand would reach out to guide hers across the page, his fingers pressing too firmly, his breath close enough to feel. He called it prayer, a sacred act between kin and God, and though every instinct in her screamed to move away, she stayed still, afraid of what defiance might bring. The first time he suggested private devotion, she hesitated. But his smile was disarming, practiced, holy. He spoke of cleansing the family's sins through faith and unity. He told her that a wife's soul could strengthen her husband's lineage, that God worked through the willing hearts of women. When he placed his hand over hers and closed his eyes, whispering a blessing, Clara felt something dark bloom in the pit of her stomach, a dread that no amount of prayer could chase away. From that moment, she knew his visits were not about faith but possession, and though she could not yet name it, the danger had already settled inside the walls of her home, breathing just behind her every thought. Clara tried to tell herself that the Reverend's presence was harmless, that his constant visits were just the way of family. Yet the more time she spent under that roof, the harder it became to ignore the strange reflection between father and son. Samuel, quiet and withdrawn, carried the same careful tone as his father, the same deliberate pauses between words, the same distant stare that made her feel like she was being studied rather than loved. When they prayed together at night, Samuel's hands trembled the way the Reverend's did during sermons, a mix of reverence and something unspoken. Even their silences matched, heavy and expectant, as though they shared a thought she wasn't allowed to know. There were moments when she caught Samuel looking at her with an expression that didn't belong to him, like someone else was watching through his eyes. He spoke of his father often admiringly, fearfully repeating his teachings as though scripture. A man's blood must stay true, he'd say, a line she'd first heard from the Reverend himself. When Clara asked what that meant, Samuel would just smile faintly, telling her she'd understand in time. It was as if the two men were connected by more than kinship, as if their souls were stitched together by the same sin that no one dared name. At church, she began to see how the town worshipped Abel as something more than a preacher. People bowed their heads deeper when he passed, mothers pulled their daughters close, and no one ever met his eyes for long. He had a power that stretched beyond the pulpit, one that even his son seemed trapped under. Sometimes, during Sunday service, Clara would watch him speak and notice the faintest smirk when his gaze met hers, a look Samuel never noticed. The congregation heard God in his words, Clara heard warning. Late at night, she would lie awake beside Samuel, listening to the distant sound of footsteps outside their window. He would tell her it was just the wind or a stray dog, but the sound was too steady, too human. When she looked outside, the shadow that passed across the yard moved with the same slow, deliberate pace as the Reverend. Samuel never got up to check. It was as if he already knew who it was, and that knowledge didn't frighten him, it calmed him. Over time, the boundaries between the two blurred until Clara could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The same phrases, the same glances, the same cold touch that made her feel owned rather than loved. She started to wonder if Samuel had ever truly been his own man or just another vessel molded by his father's will, carrying on a curse that had been waiting generations to reach her. The night the storm came, Magnolia County seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick with the scent of rain and pine, and the trees outside the lawn farmhouse swayed like restless spirits. Samuel had gone to the neighboring town for supplies, leaving Clara alone with the echoing creaks of the old house and the sound of thunder rolling across the hills. The Reverend had visited earlier that evening, warning her that storms were a test of faith and that a good wife should not fear what God sent her way. His words lingered long after he left, echoing in her mind as the wind began to shake the windows. When the first clap of thunder hit, the lights flickered, and the house went dark. Clara lit a candle, its glow trembling against the walls, and tried to steady her breathing. She thought she heard footsteps on the porch but told herself it was just the rain. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, and too calm for a man caught in a storm. She froze. The voice that followed was soft, familiar, and commanding. "Child, open the door. The Lord sent me to watch over you tonight." It was the Reverend. Her body tensed, her hands trembling as she unlatched the door. Rain poured in around him, his coat drenched, his Bible clutched tight against his chest. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes gleamed in the candlelight, calm and certain, as though he had known she would obey. He spoke of storms as cleansing, of temptation as a test. His words flowed like scripture, but beneath them was something darker, something hungry. He told her that when a man of God felt the calling of the Spirit, he must act upon it, even if others could not understand. He said the Lorne bloodline had been chosen to bear the burden of purity, that through her, God's will would continue unbroken. Clara tried to protest, her voice trembling as she said Samuel would return soon, but Abel only smiled, a slow, patient curve of the mouth that carried no warmth. God is here now, he whispered, placing his hand over her heart. His touch was cold and heavy, his breath thick with the scent of wine and rain. The storm outside raged louder, lightning splitting the sky as the candle's flame flickered wildly. He spoke of cleansing her soul, of strengthening the family's bond through divine union. His voice rose with the thunder until her protests were swallowed by the storm itself. By the time the wind calmed and the house fell silent again, the candle had burned down to its base, and the Reverend's shadow lingered against the wall long after he was gone, a mark that no amount of prayer could wash away. The weeks after the storm blurred into one another, each day carrying the same heavy stillness that clung to the house like humidity. Clara moved through her chores in silence, her body weary, her mind trapped in a fog she couldn't escape. Samuel had returned a few days later, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, the change in her eyes. He kissed her forehead, told her the road had washed out from the storm, and spoke nothing of the Reverend's visit. She watched him closely, waiting for a sign that he suspected something, but his gaze stayed distant, as though he lived in a world separate from hers. The farmhouse felt colder, the walls closer, and every creak of the floorboards made her heart jolt with dread. It wasn't until a month later that Clara began to notice the sickness. It started with nausea in the mornings, then dizziness, then an aching fatigue that left her too weak to stand for long. Samuel smiled when she told him, his first real smile in weeks, and said it was a blessing, a sign that their prayers had been answered. He spoke with pride, his voice trembling with joy, but Clara felt only the slow burn of fear spreading through her chest. The timing wasn't right. Samuel had been gone when it happened. She kept counting the days in her head, whispering numbers to herself as she washed dishes, as if she could change them by repeating them enough times. But no matter how she rearranged the truth, it stayed the same. The Reverend's visits stopped after that night. He no longer came to the house, no longer sent baskets of fruit or called for prayer. Yet his presence lingered in every room. Clara sometimes caught the faint smell of his cologne drifting through the hallways, or the soft murmur of his voice when she passed the churchyard on her way to town. She avoided the mirror now, unable to face her reflection without feeling the weight of his shadow behind her. When her mother came to visit, Clara tried to hide the swelling beneath her dress, but mothers always know. She asked who had blessed her with the news, and when Clara didn't answer, her mother's face changed, first confusion, then dawning horror. She didn't speak another word that day. After she left, Clara watched her walk down the dirt road, her figure shrinking until it disappeared into the trees. That night, Clara knelt beside her bed and tried to pray, but every word caught in her throat. The silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. Somewhere in that darkness, she realized what she carried inside her wasn't just a child, it was proof of something too monstrous for the world to ever forgive. By the time Clara's belly began to show, the whispers had already started. In Magnolia County, secrets didn't stay buried long, especially when they belonged to the Lorne family. The townspeople noticed the way Reverend Abel's sermons grew softer when Clara entered the church, how his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have, and how Samuel, once so dutiful, now seemed distant and confused. It began with glances exchanged in the pews, quiet murmurs behind hymnals, and the slow turning of heads whenever she walked through the market. The Reverend's authority had long kept the town's tongue still, but gossip, like rot, found its way through even the thickest wood. Clara tried to keep her head down, avoiding the church as much as she could, yet her absence only fed the rumors. Some said she was cursed, that the Lorne women always carried sorrow in their wombs. Others said her child was a gift from God himself, a new prophet born from divine touch. But the cruelest whispers came from those who saw what others refused to speak aloud, that the Reverend's features were beginning to reappear on her husband's wife. It was in the shape of her growing child's shadow, in the timing of her sickness, in the hollow look that clung to her face like a confession she couldn't make. Samuel grew restless. He spent long hours in the fields, avoiding her eyes, his words clipped and shallow. Sometimes she would catch him staring at her in the dark, his expression unreadable, as if searching her face for answers he didn't want to find. Once, during supper, he asked her if she had prayed enough for forgiveness. She froze, the spoon trembling in her hand, but before she could answer, he pushed his chair back and left the room without another word. That night, she heard him crying outside beneath the magnolia tree, whispering his father's name. The Reverend continued his sermons as if nothing had changed. His voice carried through the church with calm authority, but there was an edge to it now, a warning. He spoke often about temptation, about the sins of Eve, about the purity of family. Every word felt like a blade pressed against Clara's throat. The townsfolk listened, nodding, pretending not to notice the way his eyes searched the crowd until they found hers. When her child finally began to move, Clara felt no joy, only dread. Each heartbeat inside her reminded her of that stormy night, of the hand that had claimed her in the name of holiness. She knew then that the whispers outside were nothing compared to the voice inside her own head, the one that told her this child would bear more than just her shame, it would carry the mark of the man who had damned them all. The truth began to surface one evening when the Reverend's wife, Miriam Lorne, came to the farmhouse unannounced. She was a quiet woman with grey eyes that never looked straight at anyone, the kind of woman who seemed to fade into the wallpaper of her own home. Clara had seen her only a handful of times, always sitting in the back pew of the church, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles turned white. That night, when Miriam arrived, she looked as if she had walked miles through the dark, her hair undone, her face pale and trembling. She asked for Clara in a voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darting nervously toward the fields as if afraid someone might be watching. Clara led her inside and offered her tea, but Miriam didn't touch it. She sat at the table, her hands shaking, staring at the worn wood as if searching for the courage to speak. When she finally did, her voice cracked like old glass. She told Clara she knew about the child, and that she had seen the same signs before, the same sickness, the same silence, the same fear. Clara froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. Miriam's words spilled out faster, trembling between sobs. She said that what happened to Clara wasn't new, that the Reverend had called it God's will for as long as she could remember. He had told her the same lies once, when she was young and still believed salvation could come through obedience. Then came the part that hollowed Clara's heart completely. Miriam told her that Samuel might not be Abel's son at all, but his brother. The truth had been buried for decades, hidden beneath sermons and smiles. The Reverend had claimed her in the same way, behind the same closed doors, leaving her with a child she was forced to raise as both son and secret. Clara's mind spun as she tried to make sense of it, the pieces snapping together like bones breaking. The man she had married, the one who shared her bed and prayed beside her, might have been born from the same sin that now grew inside her. Miriam wept quietly, her tears falling onto the table. She said the Lorne bloodline was cursed, that Abel called it purity but it was really rot disguised as faith. Before she left, she took Clara's hand and whispered that the only way to break the curse was to leave, burn the roots before they spread further. But as the door closed behind her, Clara knew it was already too late. The Reverend's shadow stretched too far, and the blood that ran through her child's veins was already bound to his name. Clara ran before dawn, clutching a small bag of clothes and the letter Miriam had left behind. The sky was still dark, the air thick with the scent of wet soil, and every step she took down the dirt road felt like walking through molasses. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away before the Reverend found out she knew the truth. The wind whispered through the pines as if warning her to turn back, and in that eerie stillness, even the crickets seemed to fall silent. Her heart pounded with the rhythm of her footsteps, her breath shallow against the chill that clung to her skin. For the first time since her wedding, she felt alive, terrified but free, though the freedom carried its own kind of weight. By sunrise, she reached the edge of the neighboring county, but freedom in Magnolia wasn't so simple. The Launce reach went beyond their land, their name sewn into the very fabric of the town's faith. Every church, every hand that fed the poor, every prayer that passed through trembling lips owed something to Reverend Abel. His word was law, and those who defied it didn't last long. Clara stopped at a small roadside inn, asking for water, but the woman at the counter recognized her immediately. The kindness in her eyes flickered, replaced by unease. Within an hour, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the dirt road, slow and deliberate. The Reverend didn't need to chase her, his believers would bring her back themselves. Clara hid in the woods that night, her body trembling with exhaustion, her unborn child heavy in her belly. She could see the faint glow of lanterns moving through the trees, voices calling her name like a hymn. They spoke with concern, not cruelty, promising safety, forgiveness, home. But Clara knew their words were not their own, they belonged to him. The Reverend had built his power on devotion, twisting faith into a weapon that held the town captive. To defy him was to defy God, and no one in Magnolia County dared face damnation. When the voices faded, Clara pressed her hand against her stomach and whispered to the child she carried. She told it they would keep running until the land no longer knew their name. But deep down, she understood that running wouldn't save her. The Reverend's sermons reached farther than his voice ever could. He had sown his will into the hearts of every believer, and even miles away, she could feel it, his presence, his certainty, his quiet promise that no one ever left the Launce. Not really. The bloodline, he always said, was forever, and now it ran through her veins too. Years passed before anyone in Magnolia County spoke the Lawn name aloud again. The farmhouse had long since rotted into the ground, the church abandoned, its steeple leaning like a broken finger pointing to heaven. The townsfolk said it was cursed, that nothing grew on Lawn soil anymore. But some nights, when the wind blew in from the marsh, people swore they could still hear hymns drifting through the trees, soft, mournful songs that didn't belong to the living. Clara had vanished after that night in the woods, and though the Reverend had searched for weeks, preaching of her fall from grace, most knew she wasn't coming back. They buried her name in silence, the way they buried all the women who had crossed him. It wasn't until years later, when the church was being torn down to make way for a new road, that the final secret came to light. The workers found a small cellar beneath the altar, hidden behind a wall of stone and rot. Inside were books, letters, and baptism records written in the Reverend's careful hand, each one tracing generations of the same family marrying into itself. The handwriting grew shakier with time, but the names repeated like a curse, looping endlessly from father to daughter, brother to sister, son to mother. And among them was one final entry, Clara May Lawn, purified by divine union. No date, no sermon notes, just that single line and a pressed magnolia flower, browned with age. At the far end of the cellar, they found a cradle carved from oak, covered in dust but still intact. Inside was a child's blanket, faded and brittle, embroidered with the same initials that marked every gravestone on Lawn land. It was then that the old rumors began again, that Clara hadn't died in the woods, that she had given birth somewhere far away, and that the child had returned. Some said they saw him, a man with pale eyes and a preacher's voice, wandering near the ruins of the church after dark. Others said he built a small chapel deep in the marsh, where no road could reach, and that sometimes, on summer nights, the sound of his sermons floated through the cypress trees. The town tried to forget, but the blood of the Launce never really left. It was in the soil, in the roots, in the whispers of every storm that passed through Magnolia County. The line had continued, untouched, unseen, carrying with it the sin that had started in that house so many years ago, when a preacher claimed his son's wife in the name of God and cursed a town that would never be clean again.